A very warm welcome to all of you. We have now come to the end of this 12-week course on migration, mobility and development hosted by the NPTEL. So as you know, the course was divided into 12 weeks and we had 42 lectures. And what we did was, in the first few weeks, we specifically looked at concept and methods, and then we moved on to empirics and policy. Conceptualizing it, executing it, along with the 3 teaching assistants for the course, Pranita, Faheen and Anand. So this is a farewell and it's a goodbye from us, and we hope that the course was useful for you. But before we go, let me do a bit of a recap of the last 12 weeks for you. So what we really did over the last 12 weeks were 2 broad things. So first, we engaged with key concepts and theories in migration studies, and we interrogated the relationship between migration and development by drawing on theory, by drawing on empirics, and by drawing on policy. And the second thing that we tried to do is that the course also emphasized the research process, the linkages between conceptual debates, empirical realities, and policy questions. So I'll refresh your memory. I'll take you through a recap of what we did in the course. So what we did, as you might remember, in the very first week, in the first introductory class, we started with an overview of the migration, mobility and development course. We discussed its structure, I gave you a week-wise outline, the themes that we were going to cover, and I told you a little more about the sessions with the guest lecturers. Then we moved on to disciplinarity in migration studies. We examined how migration is conceptualized, studied and understood differently across disciplines, and because each discipline, as you know, is shaped by its own distinct epistemological foundation. And then we tried to look at how these perspectives of various disciplines are linked to theories of social change. So we looked at a wide range of disciplines, we looked at different levels or different units of analysis, and we spoke about some dominant theories. And then we specifically looked at how disciplinary approaches can shape policy in different ways, and even when they're applied to the same context. So after the first lecture on broad disciplinarity in migration studies, we focused on the work of 2 seminal theorists. The first is Ernst Georg Ravenstein and the second is Everett Lee. So Ravenstein, as you know, was a geographer. He formulated the first laws of migration, and we critically looked at these laws. And then we focused on Lee's 1966 paper on the theory of migration. Now this is an ambitious work, and it built on Ravenstein's earlier work, but it also gives us a perspective on push-pull. You know, the framework of push-pull in migration studies, which is so popular, comes from this paper by Everett Lee. And then again, we looked at a critique of both these papers, which largely were informed by an economistic understanding of migration. Then in the fourth and last lecture of week 1, we focused on neoclassical economic theory. And we looked at migration from the lens of neoclassical economic theory. And so we looked at micro and macro perspectives of neoclassical economic theory and what implications these perspectives have on labor migration. Then we specifically looked at Michael Todaro's paper, and it's again a seminal paper titled Migration and Urban Employment in Less Developed Countries. This was published in 1969, and what this paper does is it addresses the chronic problem of urban unemployment and underemployment in LDCs in the late 1960s. So what Todaro does is he presents a 2-stage model to examine rural-urban migration in the context of LDCs. So we discussed this paper, we discussed what implication neoclassical perspective has for policy, especially migration policy. Then in the second week of the course, we started with the new economics of labor migration, or NELM. Now this is a perspective which is developed by Oded Stark, and we saw how NELM goes beyond neoclassical economic theories, and it argues that migration is much more than a response to wage differentials or income differentials, and it also brings into focus the household. So we also saw synergies between NELM and the livelihoods approach to some extent, and we also then looked at the livelihood approach, which frames migration as a key strategy to diversify and secure rural livelihoods. After this, we move to transitional theories of migration. Over here, Wilbur Zelinsky's work is very important. So you know that there are broader demographic theories, there are demographic transition theories, and this is what really forms the backdrop for Zelinsky's very influential 1971 paper, which sought to link processes of development and modernization with patterns of human mobility. So we discussed how Zelinsky connects the vital transition or simply development, what he calls the vital transition associated with demographic and socio-economic change with a mobility transition. So in other words, again, this is largely looking at the relationship between migration and development. And in this lecture, we also engage with the critiques of transitional theories, and we highlighted how such frameworks are limited because they are unable to often account for very diverse historical contexts, very diverse socio-spatial contexts. Now, the third lecture in week 2 looked at systems theory. So, we introduced Akin Mabugonje's 1970 paper, A Systems Approach to a Theory of Rural-Urban Migration. Now, again, the systems theory is a very ambitious theory. It views rural-urban migration as a system, and it focuses on two broad aspects. The first is the spatial transformation of two areas, and second is, again, the transformation of skills, attitudes, motivations, and behavioral patterns of migrants. So what systems theory does is it extends analysis beyond individual migrants to include what Mabugonje calls subsystems and adjustment mechanisms to account for the role of institutions and social and economic relationships. Now, in the last lecture in week 2, we looked at migration networks and network theory in migration studies. Now, in this, we largely drew on Douglas Massey's work. We saw how network theory approaches migration as a socially embedded process with migrant networks understood as sets of interpersonal ties linking migrants, former migrants, and non-migrants in both origin and destination areas. And we also saw how these networks function as social capital, lowering the costs and risks of migration, and also increasing the likelihood of movement. And in the end, we discussed policy implications as well as the limitations of network theory. In the third week, we moved to more recent concepts of migration infrastructure and migration industry. Now, these concepts are relatively recent, and they're largely rooted in empirical research in international labor migration. So the concept of migrant infrastructure comes from the work of Zhang and Lindquist based on their studies on low-skill migration in China and Indonesia. So what Zhang and Lindquist do is that they argue that international low-skill migration has become a paradox. Why has it become a paradox? Because it is simultaneously easier. So international labor migration has become simultaneously easier and at the same time more cumbersome. And then the lecture finally discusses the concepts of migration industry developed by scholars such as Gammeltoft Hansen, Nyberg Sorensen, and Hernandez Leon. And migration industry is broadly defined as an ensemble of entrepreneurs motivated by financial gain. Now, in the next lecture in week 3, we discuss key theoretical challenges in migration research, drawing on Stephen Castle's seminal argument that a general theory of migration is neither desirable nor possible. Now, according to Castles, migration studies needs to be re-embedded within wider processes of social transformation rather than being analyzed as an isolated phenomena. So, Castles also engages with the mobility versus migration debate, and he argues that mobility is often presented as a postmodern utopia, while the right to move remains highly selective and is highly class specific. And Castle's paper also outlines several reasons why the development of a general theory of migration is difficult. After this, in week 3, we discussed the mainstream triple win migration narrative, which presents migration as a mutually beneficial arrangement for both source countries and destination countries as well as migrants themselves. So we spent quite a bit of time discussing this triple win, and also we critiqued this perspective, drawing mainly from the work of Hindehas and Stephen Castle. And this lecture also challenged the assumption that development can act as a quote-unquote cure for migration. So instead, there's a concept of migration hump, which is an inverted U-shaped relationship between development and emigration. So what's really being argued is that as low-income countries begin to develop, migration actually tends to increase rather than fall. And emigration is the highest in middle-income countries, and it finally declines at higher levels of income. And this is very interesting, when we look at the context of India. As we are developing, emigration is also quite high from our country. So, these frameworks are then very helpful to understand the empirical reality that we are in. The final lecture in week 3 continued the previous discussion and explored the complex relationship between migration and development. Again, we critiqued the mainstream discourse on this topic. In this lecture, we began by looking at the work of Martin Giger and Anton Picot, who criticized the mainstream migration and development discourse. And we also looked at the work of Latin American scholar Raul Delgado Weiss and his colleagues, who offer a more structuralist perspective in migration. So what they really do is they present a counter-hegemonic view that questions the root causes of migration under neoliberal globalization and highlights issues that are often ignored in mainstream discussion. And the lecture concluded with Hindehas's work summarizing and reflecting on the different perspectives that challenge the mainstream migration and development discourse. In the 4th week, we started looking at the interplay between structure and agency. So we looked at the concepts of structure and agency while trying to identify a balanced and empirically valid theoretical framework that is able to encompass both structure and agency. And so we engaged with migration theory proposed by Massey et al. And we also looked at Bakewell's understanding of relational agency and Giddens' theory of structuration that relates structures to social transformation. And so therefore, this whole discussion on structure and agency also brought in the necessity of pluralist paradigms in migration research. The second lecture in week 4 explored aspiration and desire in migration studies. And here we drew on the work of Carling and Collins, and we discussed the social grounding of migration. We related it to Bakewell's argument of the subject's potential transformation through migration. And then we moved on to Carling's concept of involuntary immobility, which is used to derive different migratory categories of individuals. And we looked at micro and macro levels of aspiration and migration as a continuum. We also engaged with Dehas's analysis of aspirations and capabilities and ended with Carling's idea of triple constitution of migration by looking at migration aspiration as a part of spatial migration. Then in week 4, we devoted one lecture to theorizing migration in anthropology. And so here we looked at Caroline Britell's 2014 chapter in the seminal book Talking Across Disciplines. The discussion began with an overview of key typologies and meanings of migrants and migration theorized across micro, macro, local, global levels in anthropology. We then moved on to the social organization of migration, kinship, networks, gender, followed by a discussion on ethnicity and identity. And then we further engaged with questions on citizenship and belonging, thematically focusing on inclusion and exclusion, and concluded with a discussion on the state, city, and multiculturalism. In the last lecture, week 4, we spent some time discussing the methods of conducting or understanding migration research. So here we discussed micro, macro, and meso units of analysis. We saw that findings and analysis are also a function of the scale at which data are collected, whether we're collecting data at the individual level, at the family or household level, at the community level, or at the level of the nation state. And each of these levels has implications for results in many different ways. And then furthermore, we also discussed the concepts of methodological individualism and methodological nationalism in the context of migration research. And broadly, we got a sense of the strengths and limitations of various approaches and units of analysis. And we also discussed how data and methodological selection depend on disciplinary training, such as anthropology, economics, political science, law, and all of this was touched in an earlier lecture on disciplinarity in migration research as well in week 1. In week 5, there were 3 lectures. The first 2 were devoted to transnational migration, where we spent some time on the conceptualization of transnational migration, drawing on Peggy Levitt and Nadia Jaworski's paper, Transnational Migration Studies, Past Developments and Future Trends. In the first part of this 2-part series, we discuss how immigrants are simultaneously embedded in multiple social spaces across borders, maintaining ties with home societies while being incorporated into destination countries. We also examine why contemporary transnationalism, which is not entirely new, has acquired greater significance while also focusing on the role of the state, globalization, and other key factors. The second part of the lecture on transnationalism dived deeper into economic, social, political, cultural, and religious perspectives on transnationalism to understand how immigrants' lives in the host country are shaped by factors and linkages between the homeland and the host country. Finally, we focused on the methodological implications of transnational studies, highlighting the need to integrate global macro processes with local lived experiences of immigrants through rich empirics. The third lecture in week 5 was the first of our guest lectures, and we were very lucky to have 16 guest lectures in this course. And so the first one by Dr. Amal Latif focused on domestic workers' migration from India to the Gulf countries, specifically centering Malayali women recruited for domestic labor or khadamas in the United Arab Emirates. Now, Dr. Amal Latif's work foregrounded women's migration trajectories, which often have been marginalized, understudied, and her work explored how questions of identity intersect with experiences of home, belonging, dispossession, and uprooting at the peripheries of transnational mobility. The 6th week of the course focused on gender in migration. So the first lecture on gender and migration examined this analytical lens, the analytical lens of gender in migration studies, and we engaged with it conceptually, we engaged with it a bit theoretically and also empirically. We discussed why gender matters for understanding migration, with particular attention to the feminization of migration, gendered labor markets and care work, and the differentiated impacts of migration on women migrants as well as women left behind. The second part of the lecture on gender and migration located the role of gender in migration across multiple levels of analysis and spatial scales, from household and social networks to labor markets, state policies, and transnational processes. We discussed how incorporating gender reshapes migration theory and research methods, and explored how migration outcomes, state interventions, and transnational practices are deeply gendered and can look vastly different for men and women migrants. The third and final lecture in week 6 was a guest lecture by Professor Neeta N. from the Center for Women's Development Studies at New Delhi. Professor Neeta examined gender and labor migration in India by critically engaging with dominant migration frameworks, official data and definition, and extensive empirical research. She discussed how women's migration, often recorded as marriage migration, overlaps with labor migration, and then how patterns of mobility are shaped by social hierarchies, by sectoral labor regimes, livelihood insecurity, and gendered constraints on autonomy. In week 7, we began with migration and human rights, covering their definition, origin, and institutions, and then unpacking the connections between migration and human rights. So, we started with an overview of the global architecture of human rights, laws and protection for the migration process, and we discussed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We also had a discussion on the empirics of the conditions of migration around the world, specifically the structural aspects of migration under neoliberal economic development. This then opened a conversation on tensions between migration, development, and human rights, reframing it within the context of the neoliberal world. The second lecture this week was a guest lecture by Dr. Mukta Nayak on migrant housing. Dr. Nayak provided an overview of housing, including its meaning, ownership, demand, and supply in the city. And specifically in the context of India, she discussed housing from the perspective of migrants in the city and addressing questions such as, what does housing mean to migrants? What is the trade-off among accessibility, viability, and affordability? How does rental housing play a role for migrants? She engaged with the debate of demand and supply of housing in India using data from the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs and the living conditions of migrant urban poor in a city. Mainly, she outlined the relationship among the urban poor, informal work, and homelessness, particularly in relation to rental housing and migrants. And finally, she discussed government policy and its implications for migrant housing. In the final lecture of week 7, again a very important guest lecture by Dr. Chandni Singh from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, we focused on climate change and migration. So, Dr. Singh took us through the causes of climate change, its risks, and potential adaptation strategies. After which, she took us through the global literature and arguments on climate change-induced migration and local realities in India. She outlined the various drivers of migration, including social, political, economic, demographic, and environmental factors. And in this, the environmental driver, which is climate change, was discussed in broad terms and in relation to risk adaptation. And further, she discussed how low and middle income countries are more prone to climate change and where do migrants settle in cities and what do they do after migration. In the 8th week of the course, there were 3 guest lectures. The first one by Dr. Kunal Keshri examined the conceptual and empirical dimensions of internal migration in India. So, he distinguished between 2 types of migration, 2 primary types of internal migration in India, permanent migration and temporary or circular migration. Now, using data sources such as the census and national surveys, Dr. Keshri explained how migration is measured in India. He also highlighted how the key definitions and concepts of migration have shifted over time. And this in turn then makes longitudinal comparisons difficult in data sets such as the NSS and the PLFS, which are the official data sources of migration. And his lecture then further presented empirical findings on the volume of temporary labor migration, the demographic characteristics of migrants, major out-migration hubs, and receiving states. In the second lecture in week 2, Dr. Soundarya Iyer explored the transformative impact of circular migration in a rural source region. She used the longitudinal village study in a village in Karnataka. So, Dr. Iyer has conceptualized localized urbanization, what she calls the spontaneous emergence of urban-style hamlets such as Mahagon Cross that she discusses in her presentation at a rural highway intersection. So, what she's saying is that these settlements are fueled by migrants returning with construction skills, capital, social aspirations. So, by shifting the focus from the city to the village, Soundarya Iyer demonstrates that circular migration is a powerful driver of rural transformation, creating urban pockets, what she calls localized urbanization, deep within rural landscapes. Her lecture gave us rich insights in the research process, and she concluded, using the method of village studies, that India's urbanization is increasingly taking place away from the metropolis. The final lecture in this week was by Dr. Chetan Chaithani, and he explored the evolving relationship between migration, rural livelihoods, and the rural-urban transition in India. Drawing on extensive fieldwork in Bihar and West Bengal, Dr. Chaithani challenged traditional views on migration and provided a nuanced understanding of how rural households navigate economic change. One of the major concepts discussed in this lecture is that migration is no longer strictly seasonal. Instead, it has taken the form of permanent circular migration, where male workers spend most of the year away from home but remain socially and economically embedded in the villages. The 9th week of the course covered experiences of Indian states in migration. The first lecture here was by Professor Iridia Rajan, and he discussed Kerala. So he discussed the evolution, the methodology, and socio-economic impact of migration in Kerala through the Kerala migration surveys over the last 25 years. And the lecture also discussed the unmeasurable social costs of migration that affect 3 main groups left behind, as well as the migration transition in Kerala. Professor Rajan further argued that despite political barriers or health crisis, migrants remain resilient. He also highlighted that while fertility and mortality are now stable, migration will be the most dynamic and defining demographic factor of the 21st century. After this lecture in week 9, Professor Jajati Parida in the second lecture took us through the Odisha migration experience using NSS data, and he showed us, among other things, how out-migration has increased significantly from the state. After this, the third lecture focused on Bihar's migration experience based on a longitudinal study of my own empirical research undertaken at the Institute for Human Development, New Delhi. I took you through how migration has changed in Bihar, offered a source and destination area perspective, and we also discussed migration policy to some extent. In week 10 of the course, we continued with the empirics of migration. In the first lecture, Professor Deepak Kumar Mishra from the Jawaharlal Nehru University provided a broad discussion of the political economy of internal migration in India. So here he, in his lecture, conceptualized labor in various facets, such as the production process, family, self-identity, migration, and social category. And similarly, he conceptualized migration and further analyzed the political economy of labor migration in India. And here he discussed the nature, causes, processes, and outcomes of diverse forms of migration, including seasonal migration, circular migration, permanent migration, distress migration, voluntary and involuntary migration. So Professor Mishra argued that the political economy of migration is understood in 4 interdependent components. The first is agrarian change, the second is informal economy, the third is social reproduction, and the fourth is uneven regional development. And lastly, he discussed the complexities of migrant labor and capitalist development. In the next lecture in this week, Dr. Benoit Peter took us through evolving trends in internal labor migration in India. So again, he discussed the nature of labor migration, issues in internal labor migration in India, and policies. So the lecture started with the fundamental question of labor migration. Why are migrants preferred for work? What are their working conditions? What is the status of their financial inclusion? Are they empowered? So it specifically focused on migrant. It discussed the education of migrant children. It discussed gender in migration as well as exploitation. And Dr. Peter brought the analytical and administrative discourse of internal migrants and their identity. He discussed structural change, components of migration such as skill development programs, mobility, government portable entitlements, online payments such as UPI networks, and along with the impact of migration from rural areas. In the last lecture, week 10, the focus was on circular migration. We unpacked the concept of circular migration and discussed its causes, processes, outcomes, and patterns. And by focusing on the conceptual understanding of circular migration and also drawing on the international migration literature, we specifically discuss circularity in the case of internal migration in India. In the 11th week of the course, the first lecture was by Dr. Adra Surendran, who shared her empirical work on migration in the construction industry. Now, this was very rich work based on ethnographic data collected in Bangalore and the source region of Bihar and Jharkhand. And here Dr. Adra Surendran showed us how long distance, short term circular migration enables profit accumulation in large scale construction. So, the lecture also highlighted the idea of flux, referring to the constantly moving and unstable construction workforce, and it shows how this mobility of labor is central to the industry's functioning. And it discusses the role of intermediaries who connect villages to urban work sites. And unlike sectors with fixed labor, the construction sector relies on mobile workers, while firms operate through layered networks that manage recruitment and labor control. Dr. Surendran showed us. The next two lectures of week 11 explored the emotions and social costs of migration. So, again, to refresh your memory, while migration studies is mostly focused on economic and political aspects, looking at emotions is an important aspect of better understanding migrant experiences. So, this lecture mainly drew on the 2015 paper by Paolo Boccagni and Loretta Baldassar, Emotions on the Move, Mapping the Emerging Field of Emotions and Migration. Here, Boccagni and Baldassar argue that emotions are not just personal feelings, but they are socially constructed and socially embedded. Later, through my own empirical work using the case study method of young migrants in Delhi, I discussed the emotional complexities of migration, how migrants often find economic success while they face social rejection in the city. We then move to the social costs of migration, which are often invisibilized in traditional research. To understand these costs, we need to look beyond narrow economistic costs and benefits and consider how migration affects different units of analysis from the individual to the nation state. The lecture disaggregated these impacts across multiple levels: individuals, migrants, women left behind, children, the community and the state. And by analyzing the intersection of class and caste, we also saw how social hierarchies are reproduced at destination sites. And then again, drawing on the case of Bihar migration, we saw that migration is often seen as a necessary means to an end, achieving a good life back in the village, rather than a desirable condition in itself. The last lecture in week 11 was a guest lecture by Varun Agarwal from India Migration Now that focused on migration policy. He discussed the Interstate Migration Policy Index, or what is known as the IMPEX, a tool designed to measure how well Indian states integrate internal migrants. Now, this lecture covered theoretical foundations of the index, the methodology used to construct it, and the results from the 2019 and post-2021 studies, the post-COVID studies. And so, what IMPEX does is, IMPEX ranks on a scale of 0 to 100 based on two principles. First is equality between natives and migrants, and the second is vulnerability, which is to measure proactive measures taken by states to help overcome barriers. So, this lecture was generally useful in understanding the construction of a policy index in migration. Week 12 focused on international migration. The first lecture by Professor Iridia Rajan was on the very important yet less studied issue of student migration. Professor Rajan highlighted that India has been observing a surge in student migration in recent years, and he discussed the patterns, causes, outcomes of student migration. He also spoke about how internal student migration is linked to international student migration, and specifically through the case of Kerala, he discusses the history of migration in this context. And in addition to the statistics of student migration that he provides, Professor Rajan also outlines the factors driving this migration, migration infrastructure, what is the future of international student migration, and its implications for society and economy, including the labor market. The second lecture in this week was by Professor Binod Khadaria from GNU, and he focused on highly skilled international migration. This lecture began by examining economic migration corridors worldwide, such as the Mexico-US corridor, the India-UAE corridor, and he discussed the nature of work and labor migration. And then he talked about the data sets of international migration, particularly from India to other countries and their nature. So this provided with us the chronology of global labor market and the migration of knowledge workers, which is linked to a surge in high-skill migration from India, particularly from leading STEM institutes such as the IITs, such as the AIIMS, and so on. And he also brought in debates on citizenship, brain drain, remittances in the context of India-USA migration corridors and the rise of the Indian diaspora post-1970s, as well as policies implemented by the Indian government. The final guest lecture was on refugees, migrants and nation state, the insider-outsider paradox by Professor Priyanka Mathur from Jain University. In this lecture, Professor Mathur discussed the relationship between refugees, migrants and the modern nation state, focusing on questions such as how does a nation state determine who its citizens are, who falls out, who is kept in, and so on. So she discussed the meaning and definitions of refugees, migration, statelessness, and she discussed the institutions of migration and human rights, what are the various roles and objectives, and she particularly focused on the refugee crisis in the world, looking at highlighting the Indian subcontinent, talking about the India-Pakistan partition, the Rohingya refugees, and so on. And the lecture also talked about the concept of globalization and a borderless world with rigid boundaries in the context of nation states. And so with that, we come to the last lecture today, which is the final lecture of this course, where I summarize for you what this course did in case you forgot. So I think we covered quite a bit of ground, and I hope we were able to fulfill your expectations from the course which we had laid out in the course outline. And so what were these broad objectives which were laid out in the course outline, which we hope we have covered. So the first was that the course aimed to engage with contemporary scholarship in migration studies. It intended to do so by critically studying key concepts and theories in migration and interrogating the relationship between migration and development. It also intended to do so by drawing on multidisciplinary theoretical and empirical literature in the social sciences. Its intention was also to focus on social, economic and cultural drivers of migration, as well as its consequences for individuals, families and societies in both host and destination regions in the context of both globalization and deglobalization. The course also intended to discuss the divide between internal and international migration. And lastly, the course intended to consider the scope and limitations of migration policies in an increasingly mobile and connected world, but also in a world which is increasingly seeing hard borders. So I think that's broadly what we set out to do, and I hope that we were able to do that. And I just want to add that we are very grateful to all the guest lecturers of the course. We had 16 guest lectures, and they were all very specific, thematic, focusing either on theory or on policy or on empirics, and they really added depth to the course. So we are very grateful. Each and every guest lecturer who took time out to participate in the course. The other thing I want to mention is that, so while the course was intended for students at all levels, bachelor's, master's and PhD students, as well as migration and development researchers and practitioners, people in development organizations, CSRs, policy think tanks. So, and so we really had a very diverse class, and so I hope that, someone was able to take away something from the course which was meaningful for them. And but we were also able to focus on the research process throughout the course and through various guest lecturers on how migration research is done. And so therefore, if you're planning your own research projects, we hope that you will find it useful. And so really thank you, and we hope that this course has been useful to you in your own academic journey, in your own scholarly journey. Thanks a lot.